Thank you, Reverend Whitaker, and thank you, President Cassidy, and faculty and staff and students of BSK Seminary for trusting me with this sacred task of opening your academic year with the Convocation address. It's an honor to be with you this morning from Minnesota, where the Luther Seminary faculty will begin our retreat in just about half an hour prior to the opening of our own academic year. And this morning, I'm rooting my address in the feeding of the 5,000. This is the only miracle story that appears in all four Gospels. So you know it is important. And because of its ubiquity in the Gospels and in our retelling of the story, some of its more profound edges have been worn away in our continued hearing of the story. So I invite you to hear the story anew this morning, attentive to what the Spirit may be doing in our midst as we gather around this sacred text once again. We begin with Jesus in a deserted place. Another translation of this is wilderness, where risk and revelation, precarity and possibility are fused in a landscape that is full of danger, but is also the most likely place the divine shows up in Scripture. Jesus goes by boat, the people from the villages and towns go by foot, and they beat him there. When he disembarked from the boat, he saw a great crowd, and he began curing the sick among them out of compassion for the crowds. But when evening came, the disciples come and say to Jesus what so many good Christian folks have said in every century since, when the church's perceived scarcity meets the world's great needs. Send them away. And as ministers and students training for ministry and those responsible for the cultivation of a seedbed for ministry leaders, this can be a convicting message for us. Now, there is no reason to think that they wanted to send the crowds away because they lacked faith that Jesus could make feeding possible. There's no reason to think that they had any idea that his miracles extended to the multiplication of food. Though when nearly the same story appears again in chapter 15, we can revisit that question. But at this point, they were just being pragmatic about the whole thing. Folks are getting hungry. It's getting late. Let's get them into the villages and out of the wilderness so that they can get a little food. It's an understandable impulse. Nothing inherently wrong with that. Then, Jesus utters one of the most political statements in the gospel. Do not miss this. One of the most political statements in the gospel. You feed them. Now, I know it doesn't seem political to our ears, but the whole story becomes an anti imperial story at this point. And when folks in your congregations come to you and say, Preacher, I wish you wouldn't get so political in the pulpit, talking about poverty and LGBTQ rights and immigration, the church is not a place for politics. It's not because they don't want you to talk about this or that hot button issue that they disagree with you about. It's because we have not communicated well enough the magnitude of the political nature of the gospel. God doesn't want you to just support this policy and not that one, or vote this way and not that, or be this party and not that one. The gospel's political orientation is an upturning of every taken for granted notion about how the world should work. And that's the lesson the disciples are about to learn. Remember, this story takes place, and this whole gospel text is written during a time of Roman occupation. And the mythology surrounding the Roman emperor included the notion that the sustenance of the empire comes from the emperor. The emperor feeds the people. So much was this the dominant mythology that Roman coins often featured the depiction of a cornucopia of fruit and wheat to drive home this point. Food is the gift of the emperor. And when you can get people to really believe in the mythology of the empire's power to take care of them, to feed them, is when things are scarce. The disciples, seeing scarcity, want to send the people out to barter and trade and buy food in the markets of the imperial economy. And Jesus says to them, no, you feed them. And in that moment, this story goes from being a nice little story about a miraculous picnic to a dangerous narrative that challenges the mythos of Rome. Suddenly, scarcity is met with abundance, and it is not the empire's economy caring for the needs of the people. And that, my friends, is a threat to power. And there are many times in the history of humanity when a community's coming together to feed its people has become a threat to the empire. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale were the founders of the Black Panthers in 1966, and their first program was the Free Breakfast for Children program, when many poor black children couldn't learn in schools because they were going on empty stomachs. Their community organized. And in 1968, the Black Panthers set up at St. Augustine's Episcopal Church in Oakland, partnering with a priest, the Reverend Earl A. Neal, and a parishioner and many neighborhood mothers so that they could feed children for free before they went to school. And by the end of the year, there were 23 cities, chapters in 23 cities, feeding more than 20,000 children for free. And that was a danger to the empire. When the National School Lunch Program administrator was called before the U.S. Senate and questioned on the matter, he admitted that the Black Panthers fed more poor school children than the state of California did. And J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, said that the Panthers were, quote, the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. Was it because they had too many guns or planned to attack some critical infrastructure, or maybe because they made some kind of threats to government officials? No. It was because of the free breakfast program that they were considered a threat to national security. And Hoover authorized the FBI's attempts to destroy the program by forging letters to stores, discouraging them from donating food and spreading rumors that the food was poisoned, and even raiding the breakfast program sites while the children ate. This, friends, is organized abandonment and the criminalization of care. Do not forget these stories. They're happening all over the country and the world right now as we sit here. And this is the context into which you are emerging as ministers, as disciples. In the end, the state couldn't win that fight against the Panthers because the empire is never as powerful as it wants you to imagine that it is. So the government subsumed the program with Congress's increased funding for the National School Lunch Program so that poor children could eat for free at school. So don't forget that we owe it to the Black Panthers and a bunch of neighborhood mothers and a priest and a congregation, that grave national security threat, who stood up to the FBI in order to engage in rebellious acts of care for one another. Healing and feeding are the markers of God's rule and reign in this passage. The kingdom of God come near in the form of compassionate healing and a feast. And this should say something to us about the kind of ministry you are preparing for, the kind of ministry that we are teaching our students to carry out. The climax of this passage occurs in these words. He takes the loaves and fish, looks to heaven, blesses them, and broke them, and gave them to the disciples to distribute. Does that sound familiar? Taking, blessing, breaking, giving, and all of them eating is a direct foreshadowing of the Last Supper in chapter 26 of Matthew. Across the Gospels, taking, blessing, breaking, giving, eating, all is a Eucharistic formula. You recognize this movement when you see it. Take, bless, break, give, eat, all. What Jesus is doing here is for Matthew and his early gathering of Christ followers hearing this gospel, a Eucharistic act, taking, blessing, breaking, giving, eating, all. And it is political through and through. And we have so domesticated the wild feast of grace that most of us wouldn't recognize a communion meal unless it was covered in a white parament and came in the form of a tiny piece of bread and a little sip of grape juice. But the same four gospels that give us the Last Supper before Jesus' state execution also give us this Eucharistic scene. The Last Supper is not the only Eucharistic scene in the Gospels. And this one doesn't take place in an upper room, but in the wilderness, a deserted place, a landscape of precarity and possibility, of risk and revelation. In the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, everyone who comes, and everyone who takes the bread and the fish, and everyone who eats it and goes away satisfied, and likely just a little confused about what kind of scene of grace has transpired before them, everyone enjoys the feast. And it happens without a lot of pomp and with no liturgical accoutrement, and they didn't even sing a hymn at the end. Sometimes the Eucharistic feast just appears before us when we need it most. And some of you will recognize this opportune time and will be called upon to serve the meal, even when every impulse in you that has been instilled in your heart and mind over the years says, send them away. But the Spirit calls and says, you feed them. Rebecca Solnit tells the story of a 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, a horrendous disaster that caused a citywide fire to erupt after gas lines cracked and chimneys collapsed all around the city. And the city government's own botched response to the disaster exacerbated the situation. Nearly every municipal building in the city was destroyed, alongside businesses, alongside mansions and slums and middle-class neighborhoods. About 3,000 people died, and at least half of the city was homeless. And members of the army from the military base in the city's north end were terrorizing many of the citizens. Amid the chaos of the city, a woman named Anna Amelia Holzhauser evacuated her home and found herself camping out in Golden Gate Park alongside hundreds of her neighbors from around San Francisco as they watched their city burn. On her third day in the park, Holzhauser stitched together blankets and carpets and sheets to make a tent that was big enough to shelter 22 people. And somehow, from somewhere, she heard the call amid this disaster, you give them something to eat. Because then she started a tiny soup kitchen with one tin can to drink from and one pie plate to eat from. And she wasn't the only one. Others around the city were cooking for one another, cooking for strangers, giving food to anyone who needed a meal. And Holzhauser got some funds to buy utensils, and she was soon feeding 200 or 300 people a day. An aid team that set up next to Holzhauser's tent made a sign and gave her kitchen the name the Mizpah Cafe. Mizpah in Hebrew can mean several things: the emotional bond between people who are separated, a watchtower where people meet during communal emergencies, a sanctuary, a place of hopeful anticipation. This is what Holzhauser's ramshackle tent and makeshift kitchen had become for her neighbors living in the park as their city burned. Solnit says, it is the disruptive power of disaster that matters here. The ability of disasters to topple old orders and open new possibilities. In the moment of disaster, the old order no longer exists, and people improvise rescues, shelters, and communities. And listen, friends, you are preparing yourselves for service in the way of Jesus at a time when we are entering into a period where preparation for collective disaster is likely the best description of how churches' ministries should be oriented in the present time. An era in which the climate emergency and ecological devastation intersects with the rise of fascism around the world, and the scapegoating of multitudes of migrants threaten the lives of people from the borderlands to our very own neighborhoods, from Kentucky to Minnesota and across the country. What comes after Christendom is collapse Christianity. And it is not likely the ministry that any of us wanted to prepare for, but it's the time that we've been thrust into. When all the things that we've taken for granted about the church, about seminary education, about the shape of ministry are being radically reconfigured for a world on the brink. When we are being invited as a church to move outward toward the multitudes in needs of healing, multitudes in need of a meal, and to set a feast of abundance for all in defiance of a politics of only enough for a few while we send the others away. Take, bless, break, give, eat all. Yet we've made of the feast of grace such a small and tamed affair that we've set up blockades to the table of grace so that only the initiated can participate, and only then if they're initiated in the ways we deem appropriate and come in the bodies that we expect to receive the grace of God. Like when several gay members of a Catholic parish confessed to their priest their questions related to their own sexuality and faith, and the priest's response each week after that was to pass them by at the altar rail each week when he was serving the elements of communion. And those excluded from the table of grace mounted an audacious and faith-filled response, renting space in a hotel lounge with a makeshift cocktail table altar, forming a new congregation, calling a priest named George Hyde, taking the name the Eucharistic Catholic Church, a reminder of the sacrament once but never again denied them. This was the first time a church had ever been founded by gay and lesbian people as a church of belonging for queer folks. And the Eucharistic Catholic Church didn't get its start in New York or San Francisco or LA, but in Atlanta, Georgia in 1946. And the Eucharistic Catholic Church not only provided the first explicitly welcoming religious space for queer worshipers, but they also broke with other exclusionary social norms of the day, forming a racially integrated community in 1946, Atlanta, Georgia, with queer and straight members and people of all denominations and no religious affiliation, but wanting to belong to a community. This is how so many LGBTQ people have come to encounter the faith, through a message of condemnation that seeps into our awareness, even when we don't hear it all that directly from our churches and families. And despite all odds, many of us still persist in our faith practice, even when we have to do so alone, and even when we have to create entirely new churches and denominations to practice our faith. The scarcity of the church's own imagination for grace is met with the extravagant abundance of a welcome to God's feast, overflowing for all. But I want to return to the beginning of this passage for a moment to really help you get the picture here. Because when we read the passage this morning, and when we typically read this passage outside of its larger context in Matthew's gospel, it becomes for us a nice little picnic scene. But when we follow the storyline, we get that something else entirely is going on here. The passage we read this morning began with the words, "When Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself." But we didn't hear what Jesus had just heard at the beginning of chapter 14, and it's this. His cousin, the prophetic forerunner of the Jesus movement, the one who was sent to prepare the way as a voice crying out in the wilderness, John the Baptist, had just been executed by King Herod. And what's clear at the outset of the chapter is that Herod had heard reports about Jesus and wondered aloud to his servants whether Jesus might not just be John the Baptist raised from the dead. John the Baptist's execution sets the stage for this scene of the feeding of the multitudes. Jesus and John closely tied in the imagination of King Herod, which means if you are Jesus and his disciples at this point in the story, the message to you couldn't be clearer. You are in danger too. And friends, uh, this is where it gets real. What you're doing here at the outset of a new academic semester, year, preparing for ministry in this place among these people at BSK is not without its dangers if it's done well. In an era when compassion is being increasingly criminalized and many of our own siblings in faith portray empathy as a sin, in that kind of environment, even feeding people, even housing people, even caring for the immigrant in your midst, even protecting the trans kids in your community will become a threat to the gatekeepers of the status quo. And the Herods of our own day will perceive your ministry as too politically subversive if you have the audacity to engage in ministry in any way that resembles Jesus. When you sense the emerging call of abundance, drowning out the cries of scarcity, compelling you forward with the words, "You feed them. Take, bless, break, give, eat all."